The sergeant's face, scarlet with rage moments before, instantly blanched, turning a cadaverous white. His eyes widened in pure terror, his mouth opening and closing without a sound. Fury gave way to paralyzing fear. He tried to stammer something, an apology, a justification, but the words died in his throat. The crowd, which had been watching in apprehensive silence, now murmured in shock and satisfaction. Lucia, without averting her gaze, took the radio from her waist. "Central, this is Internal Affairs Investigator Mendez. Requesting an urgent police unit at the Flower Street Market. We have a sergeant detained for abuse of authority." Lucia's voice, calm and firm, echoed through the radio, cutting through the stunned silence that had settled. Every word was a blow, not just to the sergeant, but to the two other officers who, until then, had maintained a posture of silent complicity. The sergeant, who seemed to have lost his capacity for reason, stumbled backward, his eyes fixed on Lucia as if she were a ghostly apparition. Cold sweat trickled down his forehead, mixing with the street dust. The other two officers, a man and a woman, exchanged nervous glances. The mocking smile that had adorned the younger officer's face vanished, replaced by an expression of panic. The female officer, who seemed the more experienced of the two, tried to hide her embarrassment, adjusting her tactical belt, but her hands trembled slightly. They knew Internal Affairs was no joke. A sergeant detained for abuse of authority, and by an Internal Affairs investigator on duty, was not just a problem for him, but a stain on the entire precinct. And they were there, witnesses and, in a way, participants. Lucia, giving no time for confusion to settle, took a step forward, closing the distance between herself and the sergeant. Her posture was one of unshakable authority. "Sergeant, you are under arrest. Any attempt to flee or resist will result in additional charges. Your rights will be read to you at the police station. Until then, I suggest you cooperate." Her voice was polished steel, leaving no room for negotiation. The sergeant, still in shock, stammered, "Investigator, I can explain." "There's nothing to explain here, Sergeant. Your actions were clear and witnessed by dozens of people," Lucia retorted, gesturing to the crowd that was now approaching, their murmurs turning into a hum of approval and curiosity. "And you too," she turned to the other officers, her voice a little softer but still charged with authority. "Maintain order and ensure the sergeant doesn't move until the police unit arrives. You are under the orders of Internal Affairs now." The two officers looked at each other again. It was a no-win situation. Disobeying an Internal Affairs investigator was professional suicide. The younger officer, head bowed, nodded stiffly. The older female officer, with an almost inaudible sigh, stepped to the sergeant's side, a hand discreetly resting on her holster, more as a warning than a threat. The sergeant, realizing his own colleagues were now against him, felt a growing despair. He was alone, completely alone. Time seemed to drag, each second an eternity under the scorching sun. The tension in the air was palpable, almost suffocating. Lucia kept her gaze fixed on the sergeant, ensuring he wouldn't try anything foolish. The crowd, previously noisy, now watched in almost reverent silence, absorbing every detail of that unusual scene. The Internal Affairs investigator, a woman alone, facing 3 corrupt officers and emerging victorious. It was a story that would be told for a long time at the Flower Street Market. Suddenly, a distant sound began to fill the air, a low hum, almost imperceptible at first, that quickly grew into a rising, deep, pulsating roar. People began to stir, looking up at the sky. Lucia frowned, curious. It wasn't the sound of a police unit. It was something much larger, more powerful. The noise intensified, transforming into a deafening roar that made the market stalls vibrate. Dust and dry leaves began to rise from the ground, whipping through the air. Everyone, including the officers, looked up, their eyes wide, and then it appeared. A medium-sized helicopter painted in a discreet grey with dark blue accents descended from the sky like a predator, hovering a few meters above the street, right in the middle of the market. The wind generated by the rotor blades was violent, knocking off hats, scattering merchandise, and making people crouch or cling to each other. Lucia had to shield her eyes with her hand, feeling her hair whip across her face. The sergeant, already pale, now looked as if he had seen a ghost. His eyes were fixed on the helicopter's side door, which slowly opened. From inside, a middle-aged man with neatly trimmed grey hair and an impeccable suit rappelled down a rope with surprising agility for his age. He landed lightly on the ground, a few meters from Lucia, and was immediately followed by two burly men, also in suits, with earpieces and a professional security posture. The grey-haired man, with a serious and penetrating expression, swept his gaze across the scene, stopping at the officers, the crowd, and finally at Lucia. His eyes, identical to hers, conveyed a mixture of concern and unquestionable authority. He didn't need to say a word for Lucia to know. It was her father, the Minister of Justice. The man approached Lucia, ignoring the dust and chaos around them. "Daughter, are you all right?" His voice, though concerned, carried a deep and powerful tone. Lucia nodded, surprise still evident on her face. "Father, what are you doing here?" He didn't answer directly, but his eyes fixed on the sergeant, who was now trembling uncontrollably. "It seems I arrived just in time." With a swift movement, the minister pulled a golden badge from his inner jacket pocket and held it up, showing it to everyone. "I am the Minister of Justice, Roberto Mendez, and I declare at this very moment that this sergeant and his accomplices are under federal arrest for extortion, abuse of authority, and attempted obstruction of justice." The words fell like thunder in the middle of the market. The crowd murmured in shock. The two accomplice officers blanched even further, backing away from the sergeant as if he were a ticking bomb. The sergeant, his face contorted in despair, tried to say something, but the words were lost in a choke. His eyes widened in pure terror. Federal arrest. That was far worse than anything he could have imagined. The game had changed, and he was losing overwhelmingly. The minister's two security guards moved with precision, one already with handcuffs in hand, while the other positioned himself to secure the area. The helicopter, still hovering above, now seemed a symbol of the omnipresence and power that had just descended upon Flower Street. Minister Roberto Mendez's words, charged with unquestionable authority, echoed through the market, momentarily muffling even the helicopter's roar. "Federal arrest." The phrase fell like a hammer, sealing the fate of the sergeant and his accomplices. The terror that already resided in the sergeant's eyes deepened, transforming into visceral panic. He tried to retreat, a primitive flight instinct, but his feet seemed nailed to the ground, his body betrayed by shock. A guttural sound escaped his throat, a mix of despair and denial. The minister's two security guards acted with impeccable synchronicity, trained for high-tension situations. The first, a tall, robust man, approached the sergeant with the swiftness of a feline, handcuffs already open and ready. There was no resistance. The sergeant, his eyes glazed over, barely noticed the cold metal on his wrists, the dry click that sealed his freedom. His arrogant posture, his fury, and his momentary power had evaporated, replaced by a pathetic, trembling figure. The second guard, with an attentive gaze, swept the crowd, ensuring no one interfered, while keeping a hand discreetly on his holster. Lucia watched the scene, a wave of relief and a strange satisfaction washing away her exhaustion. The surprise at her father's arrival was still palpable, but the sight of justice being served so categorically and irrefutably was a balm to her soul. She exchanged a quick glance with the minister, a silent acknowledgement that, despite the dramatic entrance, he was there for her, to correct an injustice that transcended simple extortion. Minister Roberto Mendez, without averting his gaze from the handcuffed sergeant, addressed the other two officers whose faces were now as pale as their superiors. "You two," his voice was firm, but without the fury Lucia had shown. "Identify yourselves. Your badges now." The older female officer, her hands visibly trembling, but with a remnant of professionalism, immediately obeyed, removing her badge from her belt and extending it. The younger officer, still in shock, hesitated for a second, but the intensity of the minister's gaze made him follow suit, handing over his badge with an awkward movement. "You are suspended from duty, pending investigation by Federal Internal Affairs," the minister continued, his voice cutting. "Any attempt to contact the sergeant or obstruct the investigations will result in immediate arrest. Understood?" Both nodded stiffly, unable to utter a word. The humiliation was visible on their faces. The career they once dreamed of, now hanging by a thin thread. The crowd, which had been murmuring, now erupted in applause and shouts of approval. The scene was worthy of a movie. The helicopter hovering, the Minister of Justice in person, the arrest of corrupt officers. It was the victory of the small against the great, of justice against abuse. Merchants and customers approached, some taking photos with their cell phones, others just absorbing every detail of that historic moment for the Flower Street market. The helicopter, with a silent command from the minister, began to descend slowly, its blades slowing their rotation until it touched the ground in a more open spot on the street, away from the stalls. The dust that had been whipping through the air now settled, revealing the grandeur of the aircraft. The side door opened completely, and two other agents, also in suits and earpieces, disembarked, positioning themselves strategically. The sergeant, now handcuffed and escorted by one of the guards, was led towards the helicopter. His steps were dragging, his head bowed, the image of a broken man. He tried one last time to turn to Lucia, perhaps seeking a word, a plea for clemency, but the guard gently pushed him forward, not allowing eye contact. Lucia felt a mix of emotions. The anger was still there, but now mixed with the satisfaction of seeing justice applied. She watched the sergeant practically thrown into the helicopter, the door closing with a dull thud. The other two officers, still paralyzed, were now the focus of Internal Affairs investigator Lucia Mendez's attention. Minister Roberto Mendez turned to his daughter, his gaze softening slightly. "Lucia, you are safe now. My men will take him to Federal Police Headquarters. The Internal Affairs of the Ministry of Justice will take over the case from now on." He paused, observing the two suspended officers. "They will be interrogated by you and your team at the local police station, under supervision. I don't want anything to slip through." Lucia nodded, her mind already processing the next steps. Adrenaline still coursed through her veins, but her father's presence brought a sense of security and a reinforcement of her own authority. "Thank you, Father, but how did you know?" The minister allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Let's just say, a minister of justice has his ways of knowing when his daughter, an internal affairs investigator, is in trouble. I received an alert about a lawyer with a flat tire and officers acting inappropriately. And as a father and as a minister, I couldn't ignore it." His eyes fixed again on the two remaining officers. "Now, investigator, take command. Ensure these two are taken to the police station and all evidence is collected, and call a tow truck for that car." With a final nod, Minister Roberto Mendez headed for the helicopter. Before entering, he cast a final glance at the crowd, a gesture that order had been restored. The helicopter, with the detained sergeant aboard, began to lift off, the roar of its blades increasing again, carrying with it the dust and drama of that day. Lucia, now alone again, but with renewed authority and the unwavering support of the Ministry of Justice, took a deep breath. The battle was far from over, but the first and most crucial victory had been won. She turned to the two officers, who now stared at her with a mix of fear and resignation. "Let's go. You have a lot to explain." Her voice, though tired, was firmer than ever. The dust settled slowly, but the atmosphere on Flower Street was still charged with electricity. The helicopter's roar diminished as it flew away, taking with it not only the sergeant, but also the most spectacular part of the drama. What remained was the raw reality: two suspended officers, an exhausted internal affairs investigator, a car with a flat tire, and a market struggling to return to normalcy. Lucia turned to the two officers, who now stared at her with a mix of fear and resignation. The older female officer, Agent Silva, seemed to have aged 10 years in a few minutes. The lines of worry deepened on her face. The younger officer, Agent Costa, kept his eyes down, avoiding hers like a schoolboy caught red-handed. The authority they had tried to exert minutes before had crumbled to dust. "Agent Silva, Agent Costa." Lucia's voice, though tired, was now firmer, more charged with purpose. "You heard the minister. You are suspended from duty, pending investigation by Federal Internal Affairs, and that investigation begins now." She paused, sweeping her gaze across the scene. The crowd, previously in ecstasy, began to disperse, some still commenting on what had happened, others returning to their tasks, but all with a different look at the two officers. Shame was a heavy cloak upon them. "Agent Silva, call a tow truck for my car and make sure the scene is preserved. No evidence can be lost. Agent Costa, you're coming with me to the police station. We need to start your statement." Agent Silva, with an almost imperceptible nod, took the radio from her belt. Her voice, as she requested the tow truck, was a whisper, devoid of any commanding tone. It was the voice of someone who knew her career was hanging by a thread, perhaps already broken. Agent Costa, in turn, looked up at Lucia, a spark of panic in his gaze. "To the police station, investigator, now!" His voice was hoarse. "Now," Lucia confirmed without wavering. "Under federal supervision. There's no time to lose. Any attempt to delay or contact the sergeant will be considered obstruction and will have even more serious consequences." She knew she had to be relentless. Corruption, once exposed, demanded a swift and decisive response to prevent it from spreading or hiding again. The fragility of the situation, the vulnerability she had felt minutes before, fueled her determination. While Agent Silva made the call for the tow truck, Lucia took out her cell phone and called her team. "This is Investigator Mendez. I need you at the Flower Street Police Station. Urgent. 2 officers under federal investigation. Prepare the interrogation rooms and recording equipment, and bring the suspension forms and documents for the seizure of badges and weapons." The voice on the other end of the line, her assistant's, sounded surprised but immediately professional. "Understood, investigator. We're on our way." Lucia hung up, feeling the weight of responsibility, but also a surge of power. That power was not for extortion or oppression, but for restoring order and justice. It was the power her father had taught her to use with wisdom and integrity. Agent Costa, still pale, made a hesitant move. "Investigator, I didn't do anything. I was just following orders." Lucia stared at him, her eyes identical to her father's, piercing his facade of innocence. "Following illegal orders does not absolve you of responsibility, Agent Costa, especially when those orders involve extortion and abuse of authority. We'll have plenty of time to discuss this at the police station." She gestured towards a patrol car parked a little further ahead, the same one the officers had used. "Get in the car. I'll drive. Agent Silva can wait for the tow truck and then report to the police station." Agent Silva, who had finished her call, nodded, her shoulders slumped. It was an image of defeat. Agent Costa, without further protest, walked slowly to the car and got into the passenger seat. Lucia took the wheel, feeling the familiar weight of power in her hands, but this time, a legitimate power. As she drove through the market streets, which now seemed emptier, Lucia reflected. Her father's intervention had been dramatic and decisive, a masterstroke that spectacularly dismantled the situation. But the real battle, the battle for the integrity of the institution, was just beginning. The sergeant was just one piece, and corruption, like cancer, could have spread. The silence in the car was heavy, almost suffocating. Agent Costa looked out the window, the city landscape passing by without truly being seen. Lucia, meanwhile, kept her focus on the road, but her mind was already outlining the interrogation, the questions that needed to be asked, the gaps that needed to be filled. She needed to understand the extent of that scheme. Who else was involved? How long it had been going on? Upon arriving at the police station, the atmosphere was different. News of the sergeant's federal arrest had already spread like wildfire. Other officers who had previously looked at her with disdain or distrust now stared at her with respect, some with curiosity, others with veiled fear. Lucia felt the stares, the shift in dynamics, and used it to her advantage. "Agent Costa," she said, her voice echoing in the hallway. "You will be taken to interrogation room 3. My agents will be there shortly to begin the process. Do not attempt to contact anyone, and do not attempt to obstruct justice. Your cooperation will be the only mitigating factor I will consider." 2 on-duty officers, visibly nervous, approached to escort Agent Costa. He did not resist, merely followed, head bowed, the weight of his seized badge and suspension hanging over him. Lucia walked to her improvised office, feeling the adrenaline begin to subside, giving way to profound exhaustion. But there was no time for that. She picked up a bottle of water from the table, took a long drink, and sat down, opening her laptop. The battle was far from over, but the first and most crucial victory had been won, and Lucia, the internal affairs investigator, was ready for the war to come. The water bottle on the table was a small oasis amidst the desert of paperwork and the brewing storm. Lucia drank the last gulp, feeling her throat scratch, but her mind, paradoxically, clearer than ever. Exhaustion was a treacherous enemy, but the adrenaline, a remnant of that surreal confrontation, still kept her senses sharp. She opened her laptop, the screen glowing in the dim light of the improvised office. There was no time for rest, not when the integrity of justice was at stake. The police station, once a stage for disdain and complacency, now buzzed with a different tension. The stares that followed her were no longer scornful, but a mix of forced respect and palpable fear. News of the sergeant's federal arrest had spread like a virus, infecting every corner of that building. It was proof that hierarchy could be subverted, that impunity had limits, especially when a minister of justice descended from the heavens. Her laptop was her weapon, and information, her ammunition. Lucia began to outline the interrogation plan for Agent Costa. She needed to be meticulous, each question a sharp knife, each silence an invitation to confession. She knew Costa was the weakest link, the most likely to yield under pressure, but also the most dangerous if he decided to protect the network. The sergeant, she imagined, would already be on his way to Brasilia, facing a level of scrutiny that would make the local police station seem like a playground. Minutes later, the door opened and her team entered, led by her assistant, Anna, a woman in her 20s, with sharp intelligence and unwavering loyalty. Behind her, 2 federal agents, serious-faced and ready for action. They carried briefcases, forms, digital recorders, and the aura of professionalism Lucia so valued. "Investigator," Anna said, her voice low but firm, her eyes sweeping the room, assimilating the new dynamic. "We got here as fast as we could. What do we have?" Lucia gestured to the chairs. "Sit down. We have 2 officers under federal investigation, The sergeant was taken by my father. The other two, Agent Silva and Agent Costa, are in our custody. Costa is in interrogation room 3. Silva should arrive shortly after dealing with the tow truck for my car. She allowed a small, ironic smile. Irony of fate, isn't it? They tried to extort me over a flat tire, and now one of them is calling the tow truck for me. The agents nodded, the seriousness on their faces unshakable. They were accustomed to the bizarreness of the world of crime and corruption. Anna, I need you to prepare the immediate suspension and seizure of badges and weapons documentation for both. Make sure everything is legally in order. Agent Torres, you will set up interrogation room 3. Cameras, audio, everything functioning perfectly. Agent Castro, you will review Agent Costa's history. Any record of complaint, any indication of inappropriate behavior, I want to know everything about him. The team moved with silent efficiency, each taking on their task. Lucia watched, her mind already immersed in strategy. She knew that the key to unraveling the scheme was not just confession, but understanding the modus operandi, the network of complicity that allowed corruption to flourish. The sergeant was the head, but a body doesn't function with just one. As Torres headed to the interrogation room, Lucia stood and followed him. The room was small, cold, with a metal table and 2 chairs. Agent Costa sat in one of them, his hands clasped, his gaze fixed on the wall. He seemed even smaller and more fragile in that environment. Fear was an almost palpable scent in the air. Torres, with precise movements, installed the discreet camera in the upper corner of the room and checked the microphone. Lucia observed Costa, who didn't even turn around. He was broken, but that didn't mean it would be easy. Fear could lead to truth, but also to lies and obstinacy. Agent Costa, Lucia said, her voice filling the heavy silence of the room. She was not there to be his friend, nor his enemy, but the personification of the law. My name is Lucia Mendez. I am the internal affairs investigator responsible for your investigation. You are being investigated for extortion, abuse of authority, and corruption. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, one will be provided for you. Costa finally looked up and met her gaze. There was a silent plea in his eyes, a desperation Lucia had seen countless times. He was young, probably inexperienced, and had been dragged into something much bigger than himself. I didn't do anything, investigator, he repeated, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper. I was just following orders. The sergeant, he told us to. Lucia interrupted him, her voice firm but without anger. Don't worry about the sergeant now, Agent Costa. He is in federal custody and will face the consequences of his actions. What interests me now is your involvement. What you did, what you saw, and what you know. She pulled up a chair and sat in front of him, the metal table between them like an insurmountable barrier. Let's start from the beginning. What happened on Flower Street? And don't give me the story that you were just following orders. Illegal orders are not orders, Agent Costa. They are crimes. Silence returned, but this time it was a silence charged with expectation. Lucia knew the first break was the hardest. Agent Costa swallowed hard, his eyes darting back to the wall, as if searching for an escape. The battle for truth had begun, and Lucia, the internal affairs investigator, was ready to unearth every layer of that scheme, no matter how deep or dirty it was. The silence in the interrogation room was a living entity, heavy and oppressive. Lucia observed Agent Costa, his closed posture, his evasive gaze. He was an open book of fear and guilt, but the cover was still firmly shut. She knew the first break was the hardest, the moment when loyalty, or what remained of it, clashed with the instinct of self-preservation. Agent Costa, Lucia began again, her voice calm, but with unquestionable authority. I am not here to judge your intentions, but to understand the facts. The sergeant is not here to protect you, nor to threaten you. He's in a much more complicated situation than yours. Your only chance to mitigate what is to come is the truth. And the truth, Agent Costa, begins on Flower Street. Costa swallowed hard, his knuckles white from clenching his hands. He looked like a boy caught red-handed, not an adult officer. I don't know what to say. Investigator, the sergeant. He was always like that. He would tell us to do certain things. He'd say it was for the good of the team, to maintain order. His voice was a murmur, almost inaudible. Lucia leaned slightly, her expression unchanged. What kind of certain things, Agent Costa? Did he tell you to extort ordinary citizens? Did he tell you to abuse the authority entrusted to you? Did he tell you to dishonor the badge you wear? Each question was a precise blow, targeting the cracks in Costa's facade. The order the sergeant imposed was the order of corruption, Agent Costa, and you, by following those orders, became a part of it. Costa's eyes filled with unshed tears. No, I'm not corrupt. I swear, I was afraid. The sergeant was. He was very influential. He threatened to transfer us to bad places, give us the worst shifts, said he'd ruin our careers if we didn't do what he ordered. His voice rose a notch, a mix of desperation and self-justification. Lucia nodded slowly, as if absorbing every word, but her mind was already analyzing between the lines. Fear, influence, threats. It was the classic modus operandi of a corrupt leader. I understand that fear is a powerful force, Agent Costa, but fear does not absolve you of legal responsibility. You are a law enforcement officer. Your duty is to protect citizens, not to extort them. Your duty is to uphold the law, not to break it. She paused, allowing her words to sink in. You had options, Agent Costa. You could have reported it. You could have refused to participate, but you didn't. You chose to participate. Now the only option left to you is full cooperation. Tell me everything. From the beginning, not just about Flower Street, but about all the other times, about who else was involved, about how the sergeant operated. Costa shook his head, still reluctant. There weren't other times. Not like that. The one on Flower Street was the first time he tried something so direct, with a lawyer no less. He seemed horrified by the sergeant's own audacity, and perhaps by his own complicity. Lucia raised an eyebrow. The first time he tried something so direct, or the first time he got caught. Agent Costa, don't underestimate me. My father isn't just a minister of justice. He has an investigation team that can unearth every grain of sand from your career and the sergeant's career. If you lie or omit information, the consequences will be far more severe than any threat the sergeant could have made. She gestured to the discreet camera in the corner of the room. Everything you say is being recorded. Every hesitation, every contradiction. My agents are currently reviewing your record, the sergeant's record, and the records of all officers who worked with you. There's nowhere to hide, Agent Costa. The mention of the recordings and the in-depth investigation seemed to be the final blow. Costa's body relaxed slightly, his resistance waning. He looked at the table, then at Lucia, and a heavy sigh escaped his lips. He had a scheme, Costa began, his voice still low, but now with a thread of resignation. It wasn't always direct extortion. Sometimes it was facilitating certain things for merchants, ignoring minor infractions in exchange for contributions. Or else he'd invent fines, small things, and then offer help to resolve them, of course, for a service fee. Lucia felt a pang of satisfaction. The first crack had turned into a fissure. The truth was beginning to flow. Continue, Agent Costa. Who else knew? Who else actively participated? Was there a network? Where did the money go? Costa closed his eyes for an instant, as if reliving every moment of his complicity. He had some contacts, people he helped in the past. They were merchants, bar owners. They paid to have peace. And some other officers. They didn't participate directly, but they knew. They saw the sergeant with extra money, with things he couldn't afford on his salary. But no one said anything. No one wanted to be the next target. The revelation was a thin thread, but Lucia knew it was the beginning of a much larger tangle. The sergeant was not just a lone wolf. He was the center of a web of connivance and fear. Lucia knew the battle was far from over, but the first and most crucial victory had been won. She had a starting point, a thread to pull that could unravel the entire network of corruption. The war was just beginning, and Lucia, the internal affairs investigator, was ready to unearth every layer of that scheme, no matter how deep or dirty it was. The silence in the room now was not of resistance, but of an imminent confession. The silence that followed Costa's initial confession was no longer one of resistance, but of gradual surrender. Lucia watched, every fiber of her being focused on capturing every nuance, every hesitation. The fissure widened, and now it was time to turn it into an abyss of truths. Agent Costa was a well of guilt and fear, and Lucia, the internal affairs investigator, was there to empty him, drop by drop. "Agent Costa," Lucia said, her voice a thread of steel without a hint of emotion. "You mentioned merchants, bar owners. Who are they? Give me names, locations. How did the sergeant approach them? Was it always the same modus operandi, or did he adapt the service fee to the situation?" Costa took a deep breath, his eyes still closed for an instant, as if trying to erase the images Lucia forced him to conjure. The internal struggle was visible, but the pressure of the room, the silent camera, and Lucia's imposing presence were overwhelming. There was Mr. Manuel, from the bakery on the corner of Peace Street. He had a small tax debt, and the sergeant helped to speed up the process at City Hall in exchange for a monthly contribution. Then Zay's bar in Central Square. The sergeant ignored noise complaints and irregular operating licenses. In return, Zay paid weekly. There was also Mrs. Fatima from the flower shop. She had a problem with a neighbor, and the sergeant intervened to resolve the situation. It wasn't always money, sometimes it was favors, products, but there was always a price. Lucia nodded slowly, taking mental notes. The details were crucial. They painted a picture of systemic corruption, not just an isolated incident. Lucia's mind was already mapping the network, connecting the dots. And the other officers? You said some other officers knew. Who are these officers? Did they actively participate, or did they just turn a blind eye? Costa hesitated, loyalty, or what remained of it, battling against fear. It was the hardest moment, turning in colleagues. They didn't take the money directly, but they saw. They saw the sergeant with money, with gifts. They saw him talking to the merchants, and they knew it was better not to ask. Agent Silva, for example, he was there when the sergeant helped Mr. Manuel. He didn't say anything, but I saw his look. He knew. Agent Pereira, too. He was always around when the sergeant made his special rounds. They weren't innocent investigator, but they weren't participants like me. Lucia wrote down the names. Silva, Pereira. The web expanded, revealing layers of complicity. Did they benefit in any way? Promotions? Better shifts? Or was silence merely their reward? Silence was the reward, Costa murmured, his voice almost inaudible, but charged with a newfound bitterness. And not being the sergeant's next target, he was. He was very good at making life hell for anyone who challenged him. Transfers to dangerous districts, impossible schedules, negative reports that ended any chance of promotion. No one wanted that. The internal affairs investigator felt a shiver. The sergeant's tactic was classic. Create an environment of fear and dependence where loyalty was forced by threat, not by respect. A miniature tyrant, operating under the guise of the law. So fear was the sergeant's main tool for maintaining discipline and complicity. But what about greed? Did he share the money with anyone above him? Was there anyone higher in the chain of command who knew or benefited? Costa shook his head. Not that I know of. The sergeant, he was the head of our shift. He acted like he owned the street. I never saw him report to anyone or share the money with anyone outside. He kept it all for himself, I think. He had a new car, a better apartment. Things he couldn't afford on his salary. Lucia pondered. It was possible the sergeant was a lone wolf, but the extent of his scheme suggested he had, at the very least, the complicity of superiors who didn't see or didn't want to see. Omission was as serious as action in the world of internal affairs. And Flower Street, how does that situation fit the pattern? You said it was the first time he'd tried something so direct. What led him to escalate in that way? Costa shuddered, reliving the moment of extortion. It was different. The lawyer, she was alone, with a flat tire. It seemed like an opportunity. The sergeant said it would be easy, that she wouldn't make a fuss. He wanted a larger amount, something he couldn't get from the weekly contributions. He was becoming more audacious, more confident. He thought he was untouchable. Lucia's voice hardened slightly, a tone of reproach that cut through the air. And you, Agent Costa, did you believe he was untouchable? Did you believe that extorting a citizen, a lawyer in the middle of the street, in broad daylight, was an opportunity without consequences? The tears that had been trapped in Costa's eyes now began to stream freely down his face. No, I didn't want to. I tried to tell him it was too much, that it was risky, but he threatened me. Said if I didn't participate, he'd frame me for something, make me lose my job. I have a daughter, investigator. I couldn't risk it. The justification of fear was understandable, but it didn't mitigate the guilt. Lucia knew he was trying to absolve himself, but the truth was there, between the lines. Fear is real, Agent Costa, but choice is also real. You chose to follow illegal orders. You chose to participate in a crime. Now your only chance to show that you are not corrupt, but a victim of a system, is full cooperation. Don't tell me what you think I want to hear. Tell me the raw, naked truth. Every detail, every name, every date. She leaned closer, the intensity of her gaze almost palpable. My father, the Minister of Justice, is personally involved in this case. He wants a complete cleanup, not just the sergeant, but everyone who allowed this to happen. If you give me the tools to dismantle this network, to expose every single person involved, your situation will be considered. Otherwise, you will just be another broken link in the chain of corruption, and the consequences will be severe. The direct mention of the Minister of Justice, not just as a father, but as the highest authority figure, seemed to seal Costa's fate. He sobbed, his resistance finally crumbling completely. There was nowhere left to run. He had a notebook, Costa began, his voice choked, but now with a thread of desperate resignation. A small, black-covered notebook. He wrote everything down there, the names of the merchants, the amounts, the payment dates, sometimes even the names of the officers who knew or who he helped to cover something up. He kept it in a locked cabinet in his office at the police station. He said it was his insurance. If anything happened, he had a way to defend himself. Lucia felt a shock of adrenaline, a notebook, physical evidence. This was gold, the missing piece to transform confessions into irrefutable evidence. Where exactly is this cabinet, Agent Costa, and where is the key? It's the metal cabinet, the third from the left, in the sergeant's office, he replied, his voice firmer now, as if the release of truth was beginning to lighten his burden. The key. He always carried it with him. on a keychain, along with his car and house keys. The Internal Affairs investigator leaned back, her gaze fixed on Costa. The information was vital. The notebook would not just be a list of names, but a detailed map of corruption, a tool to unmask not only the sergeant, but perhaps even those who, by omission, allowed him to act with impunity. "Very good, Agent Costa," Lucia said, her voice now charged with cold, calculating authority. "You made the right choice. Now, I need every detail about this notebook. What else do you remember seeing in it? Were there codes, names of other sergeants, or even higher-ranking officers?" Costa shook his head, tears still streaming, but a new kind of determination beginning to emerge in his eyes. The determination of a man who finally had decided to fight for his own survival, even if it meant bringing down those who dragged him into the abyss. The battle for truth was far from over, but Lucia knew that with the sergeant's notebook, the war was about to turn in her favor. The network would be unraveled, and justice finally would be served. The silence in the room now was not of resistance, but of an imminent confession. The mention of the black-covered notebook, the sergeant's insurance, resonated in the room like a starting gun. Lucia felt a shiver, not of fear, but of calculated urgency. That was not just a piece of evidence. It was the backbone of the entire scheme, the key to dismantling the network of corruption the sergeant wove with such brazenness. The silence that followed Costa's revelation was no longer one of surrender, but of a new and dangerous strategy forming in the Internal Affairs investigator's mind. "Very good, Agent Costa," Lucia repeated, her voice now a sharp whisper cutting through the heavy atmosphere. "You made the right choice. Now, I need every detail about this notebook. What else do you remember seeing in it? Were there codes, names of other sergeants, or even higher-ranking officers?" "No. I know codes, investigator. It was quite direct. Names, amounts, dates, sometimes a short note like license problem or silence about noise. And yes, he wrote down the names of officers who knew or who he helped cover something up. Not higher-ranking officers that I recall. He was very careful about that. The sergeant was a wolf, but not stupid. He knew where the line was." Lucia nodded, absorbing every word. The absence of names of superior officers was, in itself, information. It suggested the sergeant operated with surprising autonomy, or that he was extremely good at protecting his superiors if they existed. But the notebook? The notebook would be the irrefutable proof. "Where is the sergeant now, Agent Costa?" Lucia asked, her mind already racing ahead, planning the next steps. The information about the notebook was hot, and it needed to be recovered before the sergeant had any chance to dispose of it. He should be at the police station. He always does the night rounds. He likes to check if everything's in order, but in reality he's there to intimidate merchants who haven't paid yet. He only leaves after midnight sometimes. The Internal Affairs investigator looked at the clock on the wall. It was just past 9 in the evening. There was a window of opportunity, but it was narrow. The sergeant would be at the police station, perhaps even in his office, which made the notebook recovery operation even riskier. "Agent Costa, you will be kept in protective custody. Your safety is our priority. But your cooperation doesn't end here. You will accompany us to the police station. Your presence will be crucial to identify the cabinet and, if necessary, to help us neutralize any resistance from the sergeant." Costa's face paled. The idea of confronting the sergeant after all he had revealed was terrifying, but Lucia gave him no choice. The decision was made. "Now, I need to make a call," Lucia declared, standing up. Her eyes met the cameras, a silent promise that every movement would be recorded. She picked up her phone, dialing a number she knew by heart. The line rang only once before it was answered. "Father," she began, her voice taking on a tone of urgency he would immediately recognize. "We have a breakthrough." Agent Costa confessed and gave us the location of a notebook. a black-covered notebook in the sergeant's office in a locked cabinet. It contains all the details of the extortion, names, amounts, dates. It's his insurance. On the other end of the line, the Minister of Justice, a man of few words but decisive action, listened in silence. Lucia could almost feel the gears turning in his mind. "Understood, Lucia," her father's grave voice finally responded, without a hint of surprise, just cold determination. "This changes everything. We cannot risk him disposing of this evidence. I will mobilize a team of federal agents. They will be at the police station in 30 minutes. You and your team must be ready to provide support. Agent Costa must be kept under your direct supervision. He is key to a smooth transition. We don't want unnecessary alarms, but the security of the evidence and everyone involved is paramount." "He's at the police station now, Father. He's doing the night rounds," Lucia informed, anticipating the next question. "Perfect. This means we can catch him red-handed, with the evidence in hand. Lucia, I want you to lead the operation on site. This is your chance to show them that justice is not blind, but relentless. There is no room for error. This is the complete cleanup I promised. I want every single person involved, not just the sergeant. The notebook is the map." The minister's voice was a command, not a request. Lucia felt the weight of responsibility, but also a surge of adrenaline. This was what she had trained for, what she lived for. "Understood, Father. We'll be ready." Lucia hung up, the room seeming smaller, more charged with purpose. She turned to her team, her eyes gleaming with renewed intensity. "Get ready. We're going to the police station. Agent Costa is coming with us. The priority is the notebook and the sergeant." The internal affairs agents, who until then had been observing in silence, began to move with silent efficiency. Evidence collectors were prepared, body cameras checked. The atmosphere in the interrogation room, previously dense with Costa's guilt, now vibrated with the anticipation of a high-risk operation. Costa, still seated, trembled. He had turned the page, but the next chapter promised to be the most dangerous of his life. He would be the guide to the downfall of the man who dragged him into darkness. Redemption, if it existed, would come through this final act of courage. Lucia gave Costa one last look, a gaze that mixed contempt for his past cowardice and a cold assessment of his present usefulness. "Agent Costa," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, "your life depends on every detail you've given us being accurate. Don't fail us now." The truth, like an underground river, had finally found a fissure to gush through. And Lucia, the internal affairs investigator, was ready to transform that gush into a torrent that would wash away the filth of that police station, exposing every rotten stone, every broken link in the chain of law. The hunt for the notebook had begun. The interrogation room, once a stage for painful confessions, transformed into an improvised command center. Lucia's voice, sharp and precise, echoed, dictating orders. Each internal affairs agent, previously a silent observer, now moved with calculated efficiency, their faces reflecting the seriousness of the imminent mission. Evidence collectors were prepared, body cameras checked and adjusted. The atmosphere vibrated with the anticipation of a high-risk operation. Agent Costa, still seated, trembled. He had turned the page of his cowardice. But the next chapter promised to be the most dangerous of his life. He would be the guide to the downfall of the man who dragged him into darkness. Redemption, if it existed, would come through this final act of courage. Lucia observed him with a gaze that mixed contempt for his past weakness and a cold assessment of his present usefulness. "Agent Costa," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, "your life depends on every detail you've given us being accurate. Don't fail us now." The internal affairs convoy, discreet in its speed, sliced through the city night. The unmarked cars were like silent predators converging on their target. Inside the armored vehicle, Lucia mentally reviewed the plan, every contingency, every step. Beside her, Agent Costa, handcuffed for precaution, but also for his own safety, looked like a ghost. His wide eyes reflected the passing streetlights, but his mind was trapped in a labyrinth of fear and regret. "He's always in his office at this hour, investigator," Costa murmured, his voice almost inaudible. "He likes to feel in control, to see the movement." Lucia nodded without taking her eyes off the road. The information was valuable. The sergeant, in his arrogance, could be caught red-handed. His presence at the police station, near the insurance he so prized, was a risk, but also an opportunity. As they approached the police station block, the scene began to unfold. Federal patrol cars, discreetly positioned on adjacent streets, already blocked access. Federal agents, in dark tactical gear, moved with the precision of shadows, securing the perimeter. The operation, orchestrated by the Minister of Justice, was a Swiss watch in its execution. There would be no unnecessary alarm, but the force would be overwhelming if needed. Lucia's car stopped a few meters from the main entrance. She got out, her figure imposing even in the dark, her gaze fixed on the police station's facade. That place, which should have been a bastion of law, had become a den of corruption. But not for long. "Agent Costa, you're coming with us," Lucia ordered, indicating he was to be escorted. Two internal affairs agents flanked him, their hands on their holsters. Costa's presence was essential for a quick and precise identification of the cabinet. The entry into the police station was silent, but charged with tension. The few on-duty officers, caught completely by surprise, were quickly contained by federal agents. There was no resistance. Federal authority was unquestionable. Lucia, with Costa and her team, headed directly for the administrative wing, where the sergeant's office was located. The hallway was deserted. The sound of their footsteps echoed, amplifying the urgency of that moment. Costa pointed to a slightly ajar door. "It's there, his office." Lucia signaled her team. Two agents positioned themselves on either side of the door, weapons drawn. She took a deep breath, adrenaline pulsing through her veins. She pushed the door open with a swift, decisive movement. The scene inside the room was exactly as Costa had described. The sergeant sat at his desk, his face illuminated by a computer screen, engrossed in some task. He didn't notice their entry until Lucia's cold voice cut through the silence. "Sergeant," she said, her voice charged with an authority he had never heard before. The sergeant looked up, his eyes wide with surprise, then fury as he saw Costa handcuffed and Lucia's team. He tried to stand, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon, but the federal agents who had entered right behind Lucia had already subdued him. In seconds, he was immobilized, handcuffed, and thrown back into the chair, his weapon removed. "What does this mean? This is an invasion. I'm a police sergeant. You can't do this," he bellowed, his voice full of indignation, but with an underlying tremor of fear. Lucia ignored him, her eyes sweeping the room. "Agent Costa, the cabinet." Costa, his body still trembling, pointed to a metal cabinet, the third from the left. "That one, investigator. It's the metal cabinet, the third from the left." Lucia approached the cabinet. It was locked. "The key, Sergeant," she demanded, extending her hand. "Where is the key?" The sergeant laughed, a bitter, desperate laugh. "You won't find anything. I don't have anything. This is a setup." "Don't be foolish, Sergeant," Lucia retorted, her voice icy. "Agent Costa has already told us everything. We know about the notebook. We know you carry it with your car and house keys." The mention of the notebook and the revelation that Costa had spoken hit the sergeant like a punch to the gut. His face blanched, fury transforming into pure terror. He looked at Costa with deadly hatred. But it was too late. One of the federal agents, with the precision of a surgeon, was already searching the sergeant. In a matter of seconds, a keychain was removed from the sergeant's pants pocket. On it, a small silver key stood out. Lucia took the key and inserted it into the cabinet lock. The click, loud in the tense silence of the room, sealed the sergeant's fate. She opened the cabinet door. There, among piles of documents and forms, it was. A small, black-covered notebook, exactly as Costa had described. Lucia picked it up carefully, as if holding an invaluable artifact. The black cover, smooth and unadorned, hid the web of corruption the sergeant had woven with such brazenness. As she opened it, the pages revealed meticulous handwriting, names, dates, amounts, the detailed map of an extortion empire. "It's here," Lucia declared, her voice low but charged with triumph. She held up the notebook for her agent's camera, ensuring the evidence was recorded. The irrefutable proof. The sergeant, seeing the notebook in her hands, collapsed. His resistance vanished, replaced by bitter resignation. He knew he was finished. Lucia closed the notebook, the weight of justice in her hands. The war was far from over, but with the sergeant's notebook, the main battle had been won. The network would be unraveled, and justice finally would be served. The complete cleanup had begun, and there would be no forgiveness for those who had stained the uniform. The notebook, silent and devastating proof, rested in Lucia's hands. Its black cover, once innocuous, now radiated the darkness of a meticulously documented web of corruption. The sergeant, seeing the map of his extortion empire exposed, collapsed. His initial fury dissolved into icy terror, replaced by bitter resignation. He knew he was finished. Lucia's voice, once a command, was now a whisper charged with triumph, not for him, but for the justice he had profaned. "Arrest him," she ordered, without taking her eyes off the notebook. The federal agents acted with the efficiency of machines, removing the sergeant from the chair, ensuring he had no more chances of resistance. He was led out of the room, his protests muffled by the corridors of the police station, which now buzzed with the federal presence. The complete cleanup operation had begun. Lucia handed the notebook to one of the internal affairs agents, who placed it in a sealed evidence bag, ensuring the chain of custody. "This is the first step," she declared to her team, her voice firm and clear. "The map is in our hands. Now we need to follow every trail, unravel every name, every transaction." The police station, once a bastion of local authority, was now a federal operations center. Tactical agents in dark gear moved with precision, isolating areas, ensuring no documents were destroyed, no communications made. The on-duty officers, caught by surprise, were gathered in a waiting room, disarmed and under surveillance. The tense silence was broken only by the short, professional commands of the federal agents. Agent Costa, still handcuffed, observed the scene with a complex mix of fear, relief, and strange satisfaction. The man who dragged him into darkness was falling, and he, Costa, had been the catalyst. Lucia turned to him, her gaze assessing. "Agent Costa," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, "you have fulfilled your part. Now your safety is our priority. You will be taken to a safe location under federal protection. We will have much to discuss." Costa nodded, his throat dry. Redemption, if it existed, would be a long and arduous path, but at least he had taken the first step. He was escorted out of the room to an uncertain destination, but away from the sergeant's shadow. Lucia took out her cell phone, dialing her father's number. The call was answered on the first ring. "Father, the notebook has been found. The sergeant is in federal custody." The minister's voice on the other end of the line was calm, but charged with contained satisfaction. "Excellent, Lucia. I knew you could do it. This is just the beginning. The notebook is the key to dismantling the entire network. I want every name there investigated, every link broken, no matter how high or how deep. No stone must remain unturned." "Understood, Father. We are already assembling the analysis team. Internal Affairs and the Federal Police will work together. The priority is to identify the main accomplices and their methods of operation. Lucia felt the adrenaline still pulsing, but now mixed with the cold determination of a hunter who has just found the main trail. "Remember, Lucia," the minister continued, his voice now graver. "The people's trust in justice has been shaken by men like this. This operation isn't just about arresting criminals, it's about restoring faith. Be relentless, but just. The law must be applied with rigor, but also with the integrity they dishonored." "It will be done, Father," Lucia promised. She hung up, feeling the weight of responsibility, but also the strength of her purpose. The complete cleanup was not an empty phrase, it was an oath. She turned to her team, who were already beginning to organize the sergeant's office for forensic evidence collection. "Team, from now on, the police station is a crime scene. Every document, every computer, every record must be examined. I want a complete sweep. The notebook is the map, but we need all the pieces of the puzzle." The internal affairs and federal police agents, under Lucia's command, began to move with renewed energy. The night would be long, but the fate of the sergeant and his network of corruption was sealed. The truth, like an unstoppable torrent, had finally found its way, and Lucia, the internal affairs investigator, was ready to guide that torrent, washing away the filth and exposing every rotten stone in the chain of law. The hunt for the notebook had ended, but the war against corruption was just beginning. And Lucia, daughter of the Minister of Justice, was at its center, ready to fight to the end. She sat in the sergeant's chair, ignoring the smell of sweat and fear that permeated the air. The notebook was opened again, its pages revealing precise, almost artistic handwriting for such a vile man. Names, dates, amounts, locations. It was a meticulous diary of extortion, a detailed map of an empire built on fear and illegality. Lucia began to flip through it, her trained eyes absorbing every detail, every code, every reference. It wasn't just a list of payments, it was a complex web of favors, threats, and complicity. There were names of local merchants, small business owners, even figures who, at first glance, seemed above any suspicion. "Agent Silva! Agent Santos!" Lucia called, without taking her eyes off the pages. Two internal affairs agents approached, ready for her orders. "I want you to start digitizing this notebook immediately. Every page, every annotation. In parallel, create a database with all names and dates. Conduct a preliminary analysis to identify patterns and connections. Top priority." Silva, a methodical man with years of experience in financial investigations, nodded. "Understood, investigator. We'll also need a digital forensic analysis team for the sergeant's computers and cell phones. There's a chance of more encrypted data." "I've already requested it," Lucia replied, closing the notebook for an instant, the image of the notes imprinted in her mind. "This police station is a crime scene. No stone must be left unturned. I want all records, physical and digital, seized and analyzed. Every on-duty officer will be interrogated. We're not just looking for accomplices, we're looking for anyone who turned a blind eye, anyone who benefited from the inaction." The tension at the police station was palpable. The local officers, confined to the waiting room, exchanged apprehensive glances. The silence was broken only by the firm footsteps of federal agents and the occasional sound of a radio communicator. Federal authority was an overwhelming force, dismantling local routine and hierarchy with cold, relentless efficiency. Lucia stood, the notebook firmly in her hands. She walked to the door of the sergeant's office, observing the activity. Tactical agents isolated areas, others collected boxes of documents, while forensic specialists marked evidence. It was a large-scale operation, a testament to her father's commitment to eradicating corruption from within. The minister's voice, in her mind, echoed, "No stone must remain unturned." Lucia knew the list in the notebook was just the tip of the iceberg. The sergeant didn't act alone, and the extortion network likely extended far beyond the walls of that police station. The challenge was immense, the web vast and deep. Investigator, a federal police agent, approached, a tablet in hand. We found some suspicious files on the sergeant's computer. They appeared to be records of bank transfers and encrypted communications. We're working to decipher them. Excellent, Lucia replied, feeling a pang of exhaustion, but also a renewed wave of determination. Keep me updated. I want a clear timeline of all the sergeant's activities and who he communicated with. The night would be long, perhaps the first of many. Lucia knew the real battle was just beginning. The notebook was the key, but unlocking every door it opened would require relentless dedication. The people's trust had been betrayed, and it was her mission, her team's mission, and her father's mission to restore it. The complete cleanup was more than an operation. It was a promise, an oath that justice, finally, would prevail over the darkness that had infiltrated the ranks of the law. The hunt for the notebook had ended, but the war against corruption, that indeed was just beginning, and Lucia was ready to lead the offensive. The night advanced, but for Lucia, time had distorted. The hours merged into a continuous urgency, driven by adrenaline and the magnitude of the task ahead. The sergeant's notebook, now digitized and projected onto giant screens in the improvised operations room, was a macabre map. Every name, every date, every amount, a scar on public trust, a link in the chain of extortion that Lucia was determined to break. The internal affairs and federal police agents worked in shifts, their faces illuminated by the cold glow of the monitors. The sergeant's handwriting, once a dark secret, was now dissected by algorithms and trained eyes. Patterns emerged, weekly payments from small businesses, monthly donations from medium-sized companies, and, more alarmingly, sporadic transfers of considerable sums, without apparent justification, to accounts of individuals and entities that seemed to be far above the sphere of influence of a simple police sergeant. Lucia, with an untouched cup of coffee beside her, pointed to a connection graph forming on the main screen. Look here, this peak in payments 6 months ago. It coincides with the inauguration of the new industrial zone. Who was responsible for security and licensing in that area at the time? Her voice was tired, but sharp, cutting through the hum of the computers. A federal police intelligence specialist typed rapidly. Investigator, the names appearing here are city inspectors and an undersecretary of public works, all with clean records as far as we know. As far as we know, Lucia repeated, bitter irony in her voice. The notebook suggests otherwise. I want you to cross-reference these names with the sergeant's call records, the emails and text messages we're deciphering. No one is untouchable. While the notebook analysis proceeded, the police station continued to be searched. Every cabinet, every drawer, every digital file was examined. The on-duty officers' computers were seized, their cell phones collected. The digital forensic team worked in an adjacent room, extracting data, breaking passwords, searching for any trace that could expand the web. The local officers, still confined to the waiting room, began to feel the weight of the situation. The initial silence of shock and disbelief had given way to murmurs, to furtive glances. Federal agents, impassive, maintained vigilance, ensuring order was kept. Some of the younger ones seemed genuinely scared, perhaps realizing for the first time the depth of the corruption they were immersed in, or of which they were passive accomplices. Others, older, displayed a grim resignation, like those who knew the day of reckoning had finally arrived. Lucia stepped away from the screens for a moment, feeling the need for fresh air. She walked to a window, observing the deserted street. The city slept, oblivious to the silent revolution occurring within those walls. The image of her father, the minister, came to her mind, His voice, firm and resolute, echoed, "Restore faith." The interrogation room door opened, and an internal affairs agent approached Lucia. "Investigator, Agent Silva, one of those on duty, is willing to cooperate. He claims to have information about a protection scheme for illegal gambling houses, which isn't in the notebook, but which the sergeant personally managed." Lucia nodded, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "Take him to a secure room, record every word, and ensure he understands the gravity of the situation and the importance of every detail. Federal protection is guaranteed for those who speak the truth." News of Silva's cooperation, even if not yet confirmed in detail, was a sign. The wall of silence and complicity was beginning to crack. The complete cleanup was not just about finding evidence, but about dismantling the culture of fear and impunity. Meanwhile, the analysis of the sergeant's digital data revealed even deeper layers. One of the forensic specialists, his eyes red with fatigue, called Lucia. "Investigator, we found a hidden folder on the sergeant's hard drive. Encrypted files. It appears to be regular communication with an email address we can't easily trace. But the content, it's disturbing." Lucia leaned over the monitor, tension tightening her chest. "What do we have?" "They're reports, detailed, about police operations, ongoing investigations, even information about protected witnesses, everything being passed on. And the sender, the username is Guardian. The discovery of an informant within the police itself, passing on sensitive information, elevated the operation to a new level of urgency and danger. The network was vaster and more insidious than Lucia had imagined. It wasn't just extortion, it was betrayal, the selling of justice itself. Lucia felt a chill, but also an iron determination. The Guardian was a new target, perhaps the most dangerous link in the chain. "I want a team dedicated exclusively to deciphering these files and tracing that email address, no matter the cost or how long it takes. We need to identify the Guardian. He is the key to unraveling who is above the sergeant." Night turned into dawn, and the police station, once a symbol of corrupted authority, was now a beacon of hope for justice. Lucia, the internal affairs investigator, was at the center of the storm, guiding the torrent of truth, ready to expose every rotten stone, no matter how well hidden. The war against corruption was far from over, but Lucia knew that with each revelation, faith in the law would, little by little, be restored. Dawn advanced, heavy and relentless, but the energy at the police station was feverish. Screens flickered, projecting complex graphs and lines of code that unfolded under the tired yet tireless eyes of Lucia's team. The Guardian had become the epicenter of the investigation, a shadow lurking in the very bowels of the law. The forensic specialists, in their improvised room, worked in concentrated silence, broken only by the click of keyboards and the occasional murmur of discovery. Lucia stood beside them, observing the progress of the encrypted file decryption. Every line of text that revealed itself was a blow to the heart of justice. They were detailed reports, not only about ongoing operations, but about the identity of informants, surveillance plans, even the location of safe houses for witnesses. The betrayal was deep, systematic. "Investigator," one of the specialists called, his voice hoarse with fatigue. "We managed to break another layer. This Guardian is not just an informant. He seems to be actively manipulating investigations. There are clear instructions to divert resources, delay warrants, and even plant false evidence to protect certain individuals." Lucia felt a knot in her stomach. It wasn't just corruption. It was sabotage. The extent of the network was vaster and more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The sergeant was just a pawn, a link in a much larger chain, and the Guardian seemed to be the strategist behind many of the moves. Meanwhile, the interrogation room was a cauldron of tensions. Agent Silva, the first to break the silence, spoke in a low but firm voice to the internal affairs agents. His story about the illegal gambling houses, initially seeming like a separate scheme, began to intertwine with the revelations from the sergeant's notebook and, surprisingly, with the Guardian's files. He had a list, Silva whispered, his eyes fixed on emptiness, as if reliving every detail. A list of who paid for protection. But it wasn't just the sergeant. There were names of people from outside, big people, and the money. Part went into an account he called an emergency fund, but I suspect it was to bribe others. One of the internal affairs agents diligently wrote down every word. Do you remember any specific names, Agent Silva, who weren't directly connected to the police station? Silva hesitated, fear still visible on his face. There was a name, a nickname, the Professor. The sergeant always spoke of him with great respect, almost with fear. He said, the Professor was the one who really pulled the strings, who gave the bigger orders. The information was immediately passed to Lucia. The Professor, the nickname echoed in her mind, a new ghost in the intricate web. Could he be the Guardian, or an even higher level in the hierarchy of corruption? Lucia returned to the digital forensics room. Cross-reference any mention of Professor or Guardian in the deciphered files, in the sergeant's call records anywhere. We need a connection. The pressure was immense. The local officers, still confined, began to feel the net closing in. Some in a corner discussed in low voices, their faces pale. Federal authority was a relentless force, and with each new discovery, the hope of impunity faded. Lucia felt the weariness weigh on her, but adrenaline kept her on her feet. She remembered her father's words, "Corruption is a cancer. If it is not eradicated at the root, it spreads and kills the entire body." That Guardian with the Professor were dangerous metastases. Suddenly, one of the digital specialists looked up, his eyes wide, his voice choked with surprise. "Investigator, we found something. A communication pattern." The Guardian didn't use common email for the most sensitive instructions. He used an encrypted messaging app and the originating IP. It points to a server in a foreign country, but the initial connection, it comes from inside a government building here in the capital. The air in the room seemed to thin. A government building. The implication was terrifying. The betrayal was not just local, it extended to the corridors of power. "Which building?" Lucia asked, her voice a tense whisper. The specialist typed a few more commands, the screen flashing with data. "We're still confirming, but preliminary data points to the Ministry of Justice." Lucia's world seemed to spin. The Ministry of Justice, the very heart of the institution her father led, the place where she herself had grown up, where justice should be sacred. The irony was cruel, the pain profound. Betrayal had infiltrated the sanctuary. Her father's voice, in her mind, was no longer just an inspiring memory. It was a battle cry. No stone must remain unturned. Lucia closed her eyes for an instant, absorbing the shock. The magnitude of the task had just multiplied exponentially. The Guardian was not just an informant, he was an infiltrator, a traitor in the highest echelons. The war against corruption had become an internal battle, a fight to purify the very soul of justice. "I want an elite team dedicated to this," Lucia ordered, her voice now firm and cold as steel. "Discreetly. No one, absolutely no one, can know we are investigating the ministry. Use all resources. Trace every bite. We need to identify this Guardian and the Professor. And fast." The night, which already seemed endless, had just become even longer, more dangerous. Lucia knew she was about to unearth secrets that could shake the foundations of the country. But there was no retreat. Faith in the law depended on it. The complete cleanup now had a new and terrifying meaning. The information from Felipe, the younger coerced agent, resonated in Lucia's mind like a deafening alarm. Diplomatic plates, that seemingly minor detail, connected the dots in a terrifying way. It wasn't just local corruption, nor even just an infiltration of the ministry. It was something larger, more insidious, with tentacles extending beyond borders, protected by immunity. The luxury car, the envelope deliveries, the proximity to the ministry, everything fit into an image of power and impunity that challenged the country's very sovereignty. Lucia turned to the digital team, her eyes burning with new urgency. Cross-reference the access times to the fifth-floor terminal with the times of the direct deliveries mentioned by Agent Silva and now by Felipe. We need a pattern. And, more importantly, I want a list of all vehicles with diplomatic plates that had access to the vicinity of the ministry at the indicated times. Use city security cameras, gate logs, anything. The room plunged into a controlled frenzy. The team, exhausted but driven by adrenaline and the gravity of the discoveries, worked with almost robotic precision. Every click, every line of code, every surveillance image was a step towards the truth. Lucia felt the weight of responsibility, the sense that she was about to unmask something that could shake the very foundations of the state. Her father, the minister, had taught her that justice was blind, but also that it needed eyes to see the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Suddenly, one of the digital specialists raised his hand, his voice hoarse with fatigue and excitement. "Investigator, we found a pattern. The fifth-floor terminal was consistently accessed by a single person at the times of the Guardian's messages, and access logs show that this person has unrestricted access to almost all areas of the ministry. He's a high-ranking official with extremely high security credentials." The air in the room grew even denser. Lucia approached the monitor, her heart pounding. "Who?" The specialist typed a few more commands, and a name appeared on the screen, accompanied by a photo. Lucia felt an electric shock run through her body. It was a familiar face, someone she had seen in the ministry's corridors, at official events. Always discreet, always efficient. The chief of staff to one of the undersecretaries, a man seemingly above any suspicion. The Guardian had a name. "And the diplomatic plates?" Lucia asked, her voice almost a whisper, but charged with unshakable authority. Another screen flashed. "We cross-referenced security footage with vehicle records. The luxury car with diplomatic plates, mentioned by Felipe, belongs to a cultural attaché from a Middle Eastern embassy, and the driver, he's the same man who was seen entering and leaving the ministry on several occasions, always discreetly meeting with the chief of staff identified as Guardian." The revelation was a blow. The Guardian was not just an infiltrator. He was a link in an international chain of corruption, using diplomacy as a shield. And the professor, could he be the cultural attaché or someone even higher, using the attaché as an intermediary? The image of the sergeant, subservient to Sir, echoed in Lucia's mind. "I want search and seizure warrants for this Guardian's office at the ministry and for the cultural attaché's residence," Lucia ordered, her voice now firm and cold as steel. "With urgency, and I want a discreet surveillance team on the cultural attaché and the Guardian until the warrants are issued. No one can escape." Dawn advanced, and the city began to awaken to a new day. But for Lucia and her team, the night was still far from over. The complete cleanup was not just a promise, it was an ongoing operation, a battle to restore faith in the law, no matter how high the price. Corruption, which began with a flat tire and an attempted extortion, had revealed itself to be a hydra, with heads entangled in the highest echelons of power, with international ramifications. Lucia felt the weariness weigh on her, but her determination was greater. She remembered her father's words, not just as a memory, but as an oath. No stone must remain unturned, and she wouldn't leave any. The war against corruption had become personal, a fight to protect her father's legacy and the integrity of the justice she so cherished. The hunt for the professor and his accomplices had only just begun. But now, they had names, faces, and a clear path forward. Justice was coming, relentless and inevitable.